On behalf of all of my Library and Foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as all of you who are here with us in person tonight. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health, as well as the Mass Cultural Council, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand was once stewarded by Indigenous peoples. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I thank you all for silencing your cell phones tonight. We also look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. Ooh, there we go. Thank you. When Q&A starts, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. President Kennedy often spoke of our individual responsibility to shape our collective future by exercising our right to vote. But he also made clear that it wasn't enough to simply show up on an election day and check a box. He encouraged Americans to become what he called an educated citizenry because, as he said, the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of all. And so I'm especially grateful to all of you for being here tonight and tuning in to learn more about some of the key issues for this year's consequential elections with our distinguished guests. I'm now honored to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Errin Haines back to the Kennedy Library. She is the editor-at-large and founding mother of The 19th, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. She also serves as an MSNBC contributor. Prior to joining The 19th, she was a national writer on race and ethnicity for the Associated Press and has worked at the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Orlando Centennial. She has taught classes on race, gender, and the 2020 election at the Georgetown University Institute of Politics and Princeton University. She's currently writing her first book, exploring the growth of Black women's power and leadership. It's also a pleasure to welcome Lisa Lerer, a national political correspondent for the New York Times. She's covered national politics for nearly 2 decades, including 5 presidential campaigns, the White House, Congress, and countless congressional races. She joined the Times in 2018 as the founding author of the On Politics newsletter. She previously served as a national political writer at the Associated Press, where she was a lead reporter on the 2016 presidential race, and has also reported for Politico, Bloomberg News, Business Week, and the American Lawyer magazine. Her book, The Fall of Roe, The Rise of a New America, co-authored with her colleague Elizabeth Dias, will be out next month. I'm also so glad to welcome Amna Nawaz, a co-anchor of PBS NewsHour, where she has reported from the White House across the country and around the world on a wide range of topics. She also serves as an NBC News and MSNBC contributor. Prior to joining the NewsHour in April 2018, she was an anchor and correspondent at ABC News, anchoring breaking news coverage and leading the network's live stream coverage of the 2016 presidential election. Before that, she served as a foreign correspondent and Islamabad bureau chief at NBC News. She is also the founder and former managing editor of NBC's Asian American platform, built in 2014 to elevate stories from America's fastest growing and most diverse population. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome Molly Ball, our moderator for this evening, back to the library. She is the Wall Street Journal's senior political correspondent, covering campaigns, the White House, Congress, political personalities, and policy debates across America. She's also a frequent television and radio commentator and the author of Pelosi, a best-selling biography of the first woman Speaker of the House. Prior to joining the Journal, she covered U.S. politics for Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Politico, and the Las Vegas Review-Journal. She has worked for newspapers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Cambodia, as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post. She has received numerous awards for her political coverage. What a distinguished group. Please join me in welcoming to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm so excited for this discussion. Hello, ladies.
Hi.
Hello. So I want to kick it off by, we're all storytellers here.
Yeah.
And there's a cliche in political reporting that the best stories are always the ones that don't get into the newspaper, but that you tell your friends at the bar. So I'm wondering if each of you have a story that you like to tell from covering this campaign so far that crystallized something for you or told you something about what it is exactly that we're going through as a country. So Errin, I will start with you.
Yes.
What's your story from 2024?
Sure. Well, first of all, hello, everybody. So good to be back with you here at the Kennedy Library, less than 6 months to go before Election Day. First of all, can I just say I'm struck by the fact that we are back out on a campaign trail, because 4 years ago, we were in the pandemic and we were all kind of monitoring this thing from our homes, right? Working from home, trying to cover this thing with candidates very much stuck where they were. But I think the story I'll tell. So this would have been October. I was guest hosting on The Circus, if anybody watched that show when it was on Showtime their last season, and it was one of the final episodes. We were in Arizona at a community college, and I was on the vice president's college tour, trying to observe kind of how she was faring with young voters, but it was also right after the conflict erupted in Gaza. And so she's there to kind of tout the administration's record with young people, with young voters, with college students, with whom she had been pretty popular in 2020, and so she's does her spiel up on stage and then takes questions from the audience, and one of the first questions was about the conflict in Gaza, and I remember thinking then, this is going to be an issue. The administration is going to have a response to this because, very early on, it occurred to me that this was something that college students were concerned about, that they wanted to hear from the administration about, and that was going to be a part of this campaign, not knowing then how long the conflict was going to last, but for however long that it was going to last, it was going to have to be something that they were going to have to reckon with, and that we as a democracy were going to have to reckon with.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Lisa, how about you?
So what struck me about this campaign, this campaign is like unprecedented in so many ways, of course, right? It's the first since a major pandemic. It's the first post-Roe. It's the first post-January 6th. It's the first in over a century with a guy who was president running against a guy who is president. So it's like a dual incumbent kind of situation. And so it just felt so unusual and so unprecedented and so unpredictable. And so what struck me is when I was out in Iowa for the Iowa caucuses, which is something I've done quite a lot, as I think everyone on this chair has, and I was, doing the thing that you do, which is you talk to these Iowans who all are like very practiced in talking to reporters, because every Iowan, I think, has done 30 media interviews, at these events. And I'm talking to this guy, and he tells me, I'm going to vote absentee. He's with Biden. He's going to vote for Biden. But I'm going to vote early because I don't want to be here on Election Day. And I said, you don't want to be here on Election Day? Where are you going to be? He said, well, I think I'm going to go to Colombia or somewhere in South America. Maybe Brazil. I'm not staying here. And I said, why not? And he said, well, you don't know what's going to happen. It feels like it could be, I don't know what's going to happen. It doesn't feel like it's going to be safe. It feels like it could be dangerous. There could be violence. And then I, of course, kept talking to people. And what I noticed over that trip was like the amount of times people who seemed like very sort of rational, employed kind of people would bring up the prospect of World War III or some kind of violence or some kind of civil war. And it was not limited to party. It was the one thing maybe everyone could agree on. It was bipartisan agreement. Things seemed bad. And it really was interesting to me because I think it crystallized for me something about this election, which is, normally when you're in Iowa, people are talking to you about the economy or ethanol. They love to talk about ethanol or yes, foreign policy, and people were talking about those things, but there was this other undercurrent of like this profound instability and this fear that like something about the American experiment was possibly like fraying at the seams. And I think that is really just this undercurrent that I've never seen before in one of these elections, that's really there and it's really present and it's not always talked about, but I think it does say something about where we are post-COVID and sort of like how people are feeling.
Teetering on the brink, for sure.
Teetering on the brink. It's not an optimistic story.
Maybe pretty
It's a
dark
story.
Yeah. All right, Amna, how about you?
So first, let me just say what an honor and a pleasure it is to be up here with all of you. These are all women that I admire so much. I know you do too. We rarely get the chance to just spend time like this together.
It's true.
And so this is kind of fun for us too. Thank you for that opportunity. Also, I hear there's another event in town tonight. Thank you for choosing this one. I think we're going to deal with some bigger stuff here. It's funny to hear both of you share your stories only because it resonates so much with everything I think we've all seen, not just out in the country here, but really around the world. Yeah. And I'll say I never went into this last year, coming into this year, thinking we'd be covering 2 wars. I was on the ground in Israel days after the October 7th Hamas attack. I was just in Ukraine earlier this year to interview President Zelensky. And I think what has struck me so much this cycle is that we always know the rest of the world is watching American elections. We know they pay attention. It's always a little embarrassing when you go to other countries and you realize the depth of understanding and knowledge that they have about our system and our candidates is far better than most Americans, I think, know about what's happening in their countries. But I think it is so much more acutely true this year. Yes. Because everywhere I went, everyone I talked to, in big cities or small towns, people wanted to talk about the US presidential election. Despite the fact that they were living in the midst of war and uncertainty and chaos themselves, they wanted to know, so what do you think is going to happen? Who do you think is going to win? They knew about the issues at play. And I think to Erin's point earlier too, and to what Lisa was saying, some of these issues, they are not the top issues for US voters, right? People care certainly about the war between Israel and Hamas. They care certainly about the war in Ukraine. The economy will always be the top issue for people here, but it is registering and it matters in a way that it didn't before. It feels like this year the world got smaller. Yeah. It really does. And I think that sense of trepidation and fear and uncertainty, that's a shared sentiment around the world.
And good or bad, the rest of the world is paying attention to what happens here.
That's right.
Abortion and women's rights, reproductive access is absolutely another one of those things where people are questioning the relationship between that and even what a healthy democracy is.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I do want to get to that. But speaking of unprecedented, one of the things that is happening this year that we have never seen happen in a presidential election before, I want to sort of start with the news because we may get a verdict in the first ever criminal trial of a former president or current presidential nominee as soon as next week. Yeah. So Lisa, I assume you've been following the trial. What do you think are the political implications of it? Do you have any sense of how it might affect the election, or how do you think it's affected the campaign already?
Well, so what we've seen so far is that all these legal matters and the 4 cases have really only strengthened Trump with his base and haven't really had any noticeable impact on his standing beyond that. But there is, so far, it hasn't, one might think if you have this unprecedented situation where you have a presidential candidate facing 88 counts, criminal counts, 4 trials, that would hurt his standing, but it hasn't. But a conviction, there is a line of thinking that a conviction could play differently. And there's some polling that supports that if he were to be convicted, people might react to that in a different way than they are to the indictments. But the truth is we don't know, as you point out. We've never been in this situation before. And there's certainly people who argue the opposite, that it's unlikely to really change the numbers at all. I mean, I think what we do know is however it shakes out, Trump will either say, he'll either take it as he's been cleared of everything, or he will say that this is, a setup and he's being targeted and it's the, unfair prosecution by the DOJ. So we already know, I think, or can really anticipate how he's going to react. I think President Biden has been really firm in not talking about this at all. I suspect that will hold, although I do wonder if Trump is convicted, do they start calling him like convicted Trump or something? I don't know. But I think the people around Biden, so the outer circle of Democratic, lawmakers and people like that who are supporting his candidacy may start, once this trial is done, may start like adapting some of that language, depending how it shakes out. But the truth is, if we're being perfectly honest, we don't know, but it could have an impact.
Yeah, well, Errin, I'd like to get your thoughts on that too. I mean, one of the other unprecedented or not precedented for a very long time aspects of the campaign that Lisa mentioned is the fact that it is a rematch.
Yes.
And so when we think about the trial, is this just striking people as sort of old news, things we already knew about Trump? Is it just that he has been talking about the witch hunt for so long that it's sort of set in with people? Are people just not paying attention? Or do they believe his frame that this is all politicized? How do you see that? And what do you think are the larger implications of this being a rematch between two candidates who are so well known, who, yes, were out on the campaign trail physically, thank goodness, because I missed it.
Yeah.
But other than that, it is a repeat of 2020, is it not?
Okay, so I'm very curious. We're going to have a little poll in here. How many of you closely were watching over the last 6 weeks the election interference hush money trial? Show of hands.
Well, this isn't a fair.
I know it's not fair,
Yeah.
and yet I'm still curious.
They're
People-
all in this room.
People that could very well be. I mean, seriously, we know that people have jobs, people have lives, people are not necessarily glued to. Folks reading the Google Doc, that is scrolling for folks that are inside the room, telegraphing to folks in the anchor chair what is happening, what has been happening every day over the last 6 weeks. I think my first clue about, to your point about, are people paying attention? Will it make a difference? Was the E. Jean Carroll trial. That was a civil case, obviously, where E. Jean Carroll sued the former president for a second time for libel, got like an $83 million judgment in that case. The former president was found civilly liable for sexual assault. And so I thought, well, what does that mean, especially for women voters, right? Are they going to be moved by those allegations? Are they going to be moved by, civil liability for sexual assault? Certainly didn't seem to be the case in Iowa and New Hampshire, who were casting ballots in the Republican primary as that civil trial was going on. And so, now we have this first criminal trial that is absolutely coinciding with the campaign that is unprecedented. But I think to Lisa's point, where you have the president saying, this campaign is not just his campaign, it is his voters' campaign, right? This trial is not just his trial, it is his voters' trial. They feel like this is also them being tested, their integrity, what have you, being challenged. And so they have been very much with him in the way that they were in 2016 and in 2020. So I think what I would say is, yes, you do have two of the same candidates, but literally, this is a year where democracy is on the line. I think we say every year it's the most consequential election of our time. We really do mean it this year. Like it really is an election about whether or not we are going to have more elections. So I think that in that way, it does matter. But it's interesting because this trial is a revisiting of 2016. And the prosecution's argument, at least, is this is the election interference part happened because the former president was so concerned that if women voters found out in the 11th hour about the Stormy Daniels alleged affair, that was going to cost him some votes with women. Now, that did not end up bearing out, right? The Access Hollywood tape, anyway, did not end up having any effect on women voters who still, white women, still Republican women, overwhelmingly in the majority voted for Trump. We have a chance to revisit that. The rematch is a chance to go back and we can't say what people would have done differently then, but given everything that we have learned since, given everything that we are revisiting now, is the choice going to be the same for those? I mean, I'm particularly interested in women, evangelical women in particular, and so far the answer seems to be yes.
But, one thing that also one of my favorite statistics about this election is the number of double haters, which of course are the people in polls when you ask them, do you like Biden, do you like Trump? And they say no to both. They just hate both the guys. And that number is the highest we've seen in a long time, higher than 16, higher than 20. And I think some of that you also see. I see we have a strong Kennedy 2024 row holding strong here. And some of that you also see in like the numbers that he's pulling, and this attraction to a third party, which could have a big impact on the race. So I do think there's a sense that some views of these guys are sort of set. Actually, they've both gotten, it's not totally true. There's some data that shows they've both gotten like less popular in a lot of ways. And that people maybe are tuning it out because these were not, there's a large portion of each party that this was not the choice they wanted. And it's hard to know, certainly the presence of Kennedy throws a level of unpredictability in the election. And it's just hard to know like what the electorate's gonna look like, what turnout's gonna look like, because we're seeing this kind of rematch of candidates who are both, frankly, fairly unpopular.
I will say, your question about what's been the impact of this rematch, right? I think the most obvious sweeping impact has been that people are not excited, right? Like voter enthusiasm is very low. And most people in polling, at least at the national level right now, we don't put a ton of stock in polling. It is a good moment in time, though, to give us kind of a capturing
Snapshot.
where,
Not predictive.
the sentiment is right now, exactly. Not predictive. But their favorables are sort of tied, right? The fact that you have, for an electorate that wants a lot of change, that's frustrated with the status quo, you have 2 elderly white men as your candidates, that's not exciting. And so that's kind of the main impact it's having so far. On the trial, I think what's interesting to watch, like where we could see changes, yes, absolutely. I think RFK Jr.'s candidacy could potentially have a huge impact, in battleground states in particular. He's polling at an average of 10% or so. Those are real numbers that can make a difference in the states where we know this will come down to. But also, if there is a conviction, however the criminal hush money trial turns out, there's room slightly within some of the supporters for all 3 of those candidates who right now say that they could be persuadable. In particular, Kennedy voters. Right now, a huge chunk of them are saying they could be changing their minds in the months leading up to the election. And I think both campaigns see an opportunity there to try to get to people. What I am watching more than anything, I will say, and this goes back to something you mentioned too, Errin, is what happens on that first debate stage.
Yes.
Because there's huge interest. Even right now, something like 7 in 10 voters are saying they're going to be paying attention because the calendar matters. This is the time of year people will start to really dig into the details and make some better, tighter decisions. But when there is a stark contrast between 2 individuals sitting side by side, and maybe one is a convicted felon, maybe not, and the other is this other president that you've known for the last 4 years, I think that's when people are really going to start to make decisions and focus in on what really matters to them, one way or the other. The politics of grievance that have motivated a lot of Trump supporters so far won't change, and even a conviction, I think, wouldn't change that necessarily. His base is really largely baked in, and the numbers bear that out. But really, truly, I think by June, which is right around the corner, we're going to start to see a lot more people paying attention.
I think that's true, and I think that also that may have an impact on voters who love that other candidate that they're up against, which is the couch.
Yeah. Well, Errin, what do you make of the fact that the debate has been scheduled so early, and the way that the debates came about with the Biden campaign choosing to go around the Commission on Presidential Debates, which of course the Republicans had already boycotted. Do you think there's any significance to that? Do you think it gives either candidate an advantage?
I think this is going to be, again, unprecedented. This debate will be that because there's not going to be a studio audience. Right, and so while I think that the former president will certainly play to the audience that is, out watching this, there will not be an audience in the room for him to play to, and I wonder how that's going to affect the dynamic. Having the debates even ahead of the conventions really does kind of have an opportunity to focus people a little earlier in the summer on this election. We don't normally see general election debates happening quite so soon, but also you have to realize that election day is not really a thing anymore. We're about to start election season. Right. And so going into the summer, just a couple of months out from the start of early voting in a lot of states in the country, giving people a chance to see the candidates as early as possible too. I think that makes sense given that the calendar even for people to start casting ballots has moved up.
I mean, there's some consternation, right, over like whether this is a breaking of another democratic tradition, all this kind of stuff. I mean,
It's already broken.
well, and also the commission, like the McRib is older than the Commission on Presidential Debates. I think it dates back to, yeah.
Awesome McRib reference.
I stole it. I stole it from somebody else,
wow,
I have to say. But
Rip comes and goes.
yeah, but I think it dates back to like the 80s, the mid 80s. So it's not like 87. It's not a hugely long tradition. I do think there are some downsides to it, right? We're going to have 2 debates instead of 3. They're not going to be, it's just going to be on CNN, right? It's not going to be as broadly played across all the channels,
Everybody doesn't have cable.
Right, is not as good in terms of people watching it. But I do think you're right on the early point. Like people early, I forget the statistic, but by that debate last time around, like many people had voted.
already
People
cast their
vote
ballot,
early now, so to move the debates earlier does make sense. But look, I think this was a strategic move by the Biden campaign. He's behind. They felt like, in some of the polling, he's tied at best. In a lot of these, these swing states, he is behind, and they felt like they need to change the dynamic of the race. And the debates is one of the best ways to do that. And they wanted to get that going earlier. When you talk to the Biden campaign, what they say is they think their biggest opponent is what they call Trump amnesia, which is this idea, which is borne out by the polling, that people have rosier views of the Trump administration. They look back and they feel better about the economy than they said they did then. They feel better about foreign policy, about immigration, not about everything, but about certain things. And so, a lot of what you see President Biden and his supporters trying to do is remind the country of what they think the Trump years were for a lot of people. And they see the debate as a good opportunity to do that. I think the Trump campaign sees Biden as extraordinarily weak. I think they've made the mistake before of making expectations for the president so low that it's like if the guy is able to stand up through the debate, it's like a win for him. And you see some of that happening now, but they just think he's going to be really weak, and Trump will seem, in comparison, vibrant and strong, and it'll be a really good opportunity for them to gain more momentum. So that's sort of each side's calculation on this. But I definitely think it was a very strategic choice by the Biden campaign.
Well, Amna, you mentioned the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, and those are also new since the last presidential election. Yeah. And there is a cliche that people don't vote based on foreign policy for the most part, but it's been very striking to me how both of these conflicts seem to have been processed as almost as American wars, even though they are not our wars. We've obviously taken sides and have been quite involved, but neither of them is a war that America is actually in. Nonetheless, people seem to be following them very closely here. And so I wonder, do you think there is, we've seen, the Israel issue divide the Democratic Party, the funding over Ukraine divide the Republican Party. How do you see those sort of intercoalitional tensions playing out as we get closer to November?
What's interesting to see, and I want to draw a clear dividing line between the 2 conflicts here, because I think people see them very differently and they matter in different ways. The American public is largely coalesced around the idea that not allowing Russia to win in Ukraine is in America's national interest. Polling bears that out, sentiment bears that out. Questions over funding, the degree to funding, how long we continue funding, I think that's where the details get a little more interesting and the nuances matter, but by and large, that's where the country is. I think that's why there was kind of such outrage over the fact that Republicans held up that funding for as many months as they did, because the American public was largely behind it, like help Ukraine, help them defend themselves. Where we've seen, I think, the most impact on this political cycle has definitely been Israel's war in Gaza. And that's because the drag that you're seeing, the loss of support for President Biden, has largely been among young voters and voters of color who find themselves more aligned with the Palestinian movement than they do necessarily with Israel's right to defend itself by whatever means necessary. And that's what we're seeing bear out on college campuses. That's what we're seeing, young people in terms of when they're answering questions in polls, and voters of color in particular. And that's the coalition, that's the part of the coalition that helped to propel Biden to the White House in 2020. So you're seeing that in particular in some of those more diverse Sun Belt states, right? In Arizona and Georgia and Nevada. You're seeing a lot of those people, in some cases, raise about, whether they might just stay home. And I think particularly, Michigan is the prime example of this, right? And when you talk to people on the ground there, there's such a clear divide in terms of what they want to see the White House do, what they want to see President Biden do. It's the home of the largest Arab American and Muslim American population in the country. And everyone I talk to on the ground there will say to a T, I may just stay home. My vote is not guaranteed. And I think Democrats on the ground there know that. I've talked to Governor Whitmer about that. She knows that she's been messaging around this in her home community as well. It's a real question. I mean, it is sort of unprecedented. Again, we keep returning to this word, but it's a real question because it's already proven to be a drag for the Biden campaign, and we don't know where the war is going to be when people do start to cast ballots.
Yeah, and just the idea that the Biden-Harris administration is running on the case for democracy, right? And so making that case at home, given how voters may feel about these conflicts that are happening abroad, wanting this administration, if you're going to persuade me as a voter, convince me of why I should believe that America is serious about democracy if I'm somebody that is at odds with America's position on what's happening in Israel. Definitely much more so, I would think, than Ukraine. I think the other thing that's interesting, too, is that, 4 years ago, especially as it pertained to young voters, you had a protest movement over a racial reckoning, factoring very prominently going into the election. So young people making their voices heard, that led to record voter turnout in 2020. I don't know if that is going to be the case this year, but I think that you do have so many young people, so many young voters that we talk to who are ready to make this their single issue, and take a moral stand in a way that you don't always see young people, you don't always see voters, period, doing. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the role of protest, even over a totally separate issue, could play a role going into the fall.
I'm a little skeptical on whether how significant the Gaza issue will be once we come to actual voting. I think first, I just think there's a long way to go. I think it's a very active conflict. It could be resolved in some way. I think Americans traditionally do not, this is a different year, to be sure. They traditionally do not vote on foreign policy. And I also think when you ask students and younger voters, like the best survey of young voters comes from actually in this town, from Harvard. And when you ask them, like, how does this rank Israel-Palestine, it's number 13, below a lot of other things, not only economic things like jobs and the economy and student debt, but even social issues, domestic social issues like abortion or protecting democracy or things like that. So I think these protests have been very vocal, for sure. Basically no Democratic official has been able to go anywhere and give any, I've talked to, Democratic officials at every level of government, from city council members to mayors to certainly to the president, and they're unable, there was a period where they were unable to campaign without being vocally protested and disrupted in ways that made it really hard for them to campaign, or in some cases even conduct city council meetings, sort of the basic functions of government. I just wonder if that's gone on for longer than I think a lot of people anticipated, but I do wonder if it's still happening in the fall and what that looks like. And when these young voters, I think you can probably assume that most of the people who are vocally protesting about the war in Gaza are, from what we've seen, on the more liberal side of things, when they are confronted with this actual choice and what it is. And if some of that sense of Trump amnesia chips away, if they actually stay home, or it's hard for me to see that they're turning to Trump in large portions,
right,
but they actually stay home. And maybe they will, and certainly some of them will, but do enough of them do so in swing states where it's significant? And the only place where we really think that such a thing could happen is Michigan.
That's right.
So it's, it's really hard to say. And I'm just not sure. It's all over the news now.
Yeah.
But, we're still a ways off.
And this is, I think, where the calendar really matters. This is why we keep coming back. There will be this collision of factors, right? what happens next in the war, what happens in the debate, what happens in this criminal trial. All of these things coming together and coalescing, I think over the next several months, will absolutely shift at the margins. And these are elections won and lost on the margins.
Yeah, I mean, even in Michigan, Arab American voters are something like 1% of the vote, but that was a very, 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 very close state in 2020.
And also, like, a lot of this, I think, is being fueled by how younger voters take their news in, which is largely on social media and, you know, TikTok and all that stuff. And those places are flooded right now with images of this war. And is that still going to be the case in September? I don't know. Or it's the next thing, you know?
Well, so Lisa, you have a book coming out very soon about another a galvanizing issue that we've seen cause a huge amount of turnout since what is it called? The fall of Roe.
The fall of Roe and the rise of a new America. You could pre-order it.
Now available for
Now available for pre-order. Yeah.
Anywhere books are sold.
We did the sales pitch. Yeah.
I'm very excited to read this book. And one thing I think
guys.
it's easy to lose sight of, just because the news cycle can be so fast-paced, is as you said, this is the first presidential election. The Roe was overturned in 2022, which is like yesterday. So how do you see that playing out electorally? Obviously, the Democrats are really hoping that it's on the top of everyone's minds. Are you skeptical of that at all? Where do you see it going?
Well, we've seen that it's been a factor in every election since Roe fell, which, you know, since Dobbs. So it is definitely an enduring issue. I think there's and I think what's kept it so enduring is this like drumbeat of news, right? Another state is passing a law, or another state is doing a ban, or like Arizona is really a great test case for this, where the state legislature passed like basically a total ban, and then they dialed it back, and there's a referendum on the ballot. So it's been kept as this very live issue because of all the action that's been happening in these states. Much to Republicans' chagrin, because they really haven't come out with like a very politically effective way to deal with this. You see the Biden campaign leaning very heavily into it because they know it's something that motivates this coalition of voters, which is really Democrats, some moderate Republicans, independent voters. While they may not list abortion as their top issue, it's become a litmus test issue for them, where they will not vote for someone that they don't believe supports some form of abortion rights. So that's why it's such a powerful issue for the Democrats. I just don't anticipate that dying out anytime soon, because we're still going to have these cases that just really overtake the national conversation. So I think that's part of the staying power. I also think, you know, Republicans are really fighting a half century of history here, where they were saying that they wanted to overturn Roe, that they wanted to return it to the states, and now it's been returned to the states. And like what the polling shows us is that's not all that popular, that Roe always had some form of legalized abortion. People, you know, debate where the line should be and whether should it be 12 weeks or 15 weeks or no limits, but some form of legalized abortion has been supported by a majority of Americans for decades at this point. So when that went away, and I think a lot of people didn't see that coming, it was very shocking and it was very politically potent, and I think it's really remained that way since.
And the interesting thing too has been to see how Republicans are still really struggling to come up with any kind of coherent message around what is the platform, right? You can look at things like Project 2025 and see what their plans are, laying out a potential healthcare policy or abortion rights policy, but then you see the presumptive nominee himself, and in the same day will contradict himself about what he would or would not support when it comes to contraception or abortion rights.
Right. Yeah. Part of their problem is the issue with former President Trump, right? Like this has never been his personal positions on this have been all over the map, right?
Continue
he was,
to be so.
and so he's never really been all that comfortable talking about it. And so when he does talk about it, he just doesn't, look, what is he, 78? He's a 78-year-old man talking about a uterus. It's not like, I think, the most comfortable situation for him. And he just doesn't, he sort of makes these slip-ups. Like he had one this week where he was asked about banning or whether states should be allowed to restrict access to contraception. Mm-hmm. Access to contraception is overwhelmingly popular, like 80% of the country, kind of numbers you don't see for a lot of issues. And he said, well, I don't know, we got to look at it. Maybe the states should just do what they want, where like contraception's legal in every state now. So that was seen, I don't think he necessarily intended this way, but that was sort of a gift to the Biden campaign.
And there have been those gifts, and I think there will continue to be those gifts, because what was also not anticipated was all the fallout.
Yes.
The various ways that we were going to see fallout from the Dobbs decision. The IVF case in Alabama, prime example of that. It's like, wait, we want IVF. We didn't mean that. And it's like, well, they did mean that in Alabama until they didn't, and realized that was maybe not such a good idea. Louisiana, I mean, literally just this week, passing a bill saying mifepristone is now, trying to criminalize mifepristone as the first state to do that. Other states are looking at this and saying, well, maybe we should be thinking about this, or what are we going to do about it, or what is the reaction to this? Are people paying attention to this, and is this something that we might also be able to do? I think contraception is absolutely kind of the next battleground. Dobbs was not kind of the end of this fight for folks, and so I think again that could be an area where young voters come into play. Gen Z voters, basically people of reproductive age who are now like, wait, contraception's on the table? Like I didn't think about that. I didn't realize that this could also be an issue, and that could really galvanize folks who are really just kind of thinking about the continued erosion of their rights, which is something that Democrats have seized on, and certainly something that Kamala Harris, tries to put out there every time that she's on the campaign trail, making that connection between democracy, rights, and reproductive rights in particular.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a minute, because I think, we've seen Trump try to triangulate this issue, right? Saying that he would leave it to the states. And people look at him, they don't see a Mike Pence, right? He's not someone who's been a crusading Christian conservative throughout his career. People know that he was a New York liberal who was pro-choice before he ran for president as a Republican, and, paid off his alleged mistresses, for example. Not exactly your standard sort of religious right anti-abortion figure, and it certainly doesn't seem to have budged the polls so far. Do you think there's I think what you would hear from Republicans on this is that Democrats are going to overplay their hand, and when you look at the issues, people are going to be more concerned about how much groceries cost and sort of those pocketbook issues that they face day to day. What do you say to that? Do you think there's a chance that that's how it plays out?
Well, I think so. Abortion is definitely on the ballot again this year. Let me just say that full stop. I do believe that. I believe that women are again going to be the deciders of this election, as more than half the population, more than half the electorate. But because this is the first presidential election post Roe. We saw post 2022 the success of all of these abortion ballot measures, for example, and even candidates for Congress who were running on abortion who were having more success than Republicans who were kind of running and cast or seen as too extreme and lost a lot of those elections. But especially in battleground states where you have abortion ballot measures and you have presidential election, it could be very interesting to see whether some people say, yes, I want to preserve abortion, access to abortion through this referendum, but then I may also that may be a permission structure for me to still vote for Donald Trump.
I think the midterms are a really interesting example to look at, because in the midterms, right, a lot of people anticipated that there'd be a big red wave and Republicans could,
Not the 19th, I just want to say that.
Okay. Republicans would do really well. And what we saw was, and on these issues of, cost of living inflation, crime, and what we saw there was sort of a bifurcated situation where Republicans did flip a bunch of seats in New York that, won them this slim House majority, but in states where abortion was more directly on the ballot, where abortion was at risk, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, where there was a referendum on the ballot, Democrats did much better. And so you have a similar dynamic this time around, certainly with Arizona, with Florida, with North Carolina, what other states am I forgetting? Some key, what?
Did you say Florida?
Yeah, I said Florida. Yeah, Florida. Some key swing
Nevada,
states.
I think.
Oh, Nevada, yeah, where it is this live issue, where it could be more, motivating to voters. And the question is sort of like, does it drive? This is a base turnout election, right? Because of what we were saying before, views of these guys are. I am really not. Looking forward to the assignment from my editor when it comes down to find the one person who doesn't have views yet with either one of these guys. I feel like people sort of know what they think about these two candidates. And so the question is who's able to drive more of their voters out to the polls. And what Democrats see in abortion is it's something that gets their people off, what you were saying, the third candidate? What was
Yeah,
the couch?
the couch.
The couch.
I mean, look, the top issues are clear, right? We know what
Yeah.
those are for most voters. It's the economy, cost of living, immigration is up in the top 3 this year. Preserving democracy has found its way into the top 3, top 4, depending on the polls as well. And when you look at all the issues that people rank in their top 10, I think the reason you're going to continue to hear so much about this from the Biden-Harris campaign, and why Democrats are particularly leaning into it in states like Michigan and elsewhere, is because of all the issues. When people look and say, who do I think would handle these better? Trump leads when it comes to the economy, when it comes to foreign issues, when it comes to immigration. The two that President Biden leads on are preserving democracy and abortion rights. And those are going to be the top 2 issues we continually hear from the campaign, specifically because of that. But it is a turnout election. And those women in those places, in the suburbs of Pennsylvania, in the suburbs of Michigan, the people who are still voting for Nikki Haley in some cases, even though she suspended her campaign in March, those are the people that Trump is going to have to convince, and that's where the issue matters.
And let's also, but we also, I think we as a political press also have to ask voters, particularly women voters, what do you mean when you say the economy is your top issue? A lot of times when we are asking them that, abortion is an economic issue for them, right? We know that so many of the people that are getting abortion care are they're already moms, right? They cannot handle another pregnancy. They're making this choice, because it is in a lot of cases not necessarily a just a healthcare issue, but also an issue of their economic quality of life.
Well, Amna, let's talk some more about the economy, because it is perpetually a top issue, and we've heard so much frustration, particularly from Democrats in the Biden campaign, that with unemployment at long-term historic low, yada yada yada, that nonetheless voters feel just awful about the economy, and inflation is persistently higher than the target, and the cure is as bad as the disease, right? Because the Fed has raised interest rates, which raises people's housing costs. Is that all it's about? Where do we get this sense of economic malaise that seems to be so widespread, and how do you see that?
I feel like you get different answers depending on who you talk to, and we've talked to Federal Reserve heads and economists who track this kind of stuff, social scientists. This whole idea of a vibe session, I think, is very, very real. There's some portion, a significant portion of the American electorate right now that believes we are in a recession, even though we are definitely not. And I think one of the most troubling things for the Biden campaign, we know it's been troubling for them because we hear about this, is over the last 6 months, even if you just look at those battleground states, right? In the last 6 months, the economy has improved dramatically. Yeah. Like inflation has come down. Unemployment remains at historic lows. Fed hasn't cut interest rates yet, and we know some of these are lagging factors, so the cost of living still remains high for a lot of people, but the economy is definitely improving, and despite that trend, you've still not seen the numbers in terms of approval or support for President Biden budge, and that's very frustrating for them. I don't know why it is. I think depending on who you talk to, there is this sense that it is tied into a general sense of malaise and discontent, that things are higher than they have been historically, and I remember them being, and so I'm going to continue to be upset and discontent with that until they come back down, that improvement is not enough. I've heard it articulated within the campaign, the Biden campaign before, that it doesn't have to be all the way there, down to the target 2%, down to the cost of living they remember. It just needs to be continually improving when people go to cast ballots, so they know it's getting better, and they point to historical examples of presidential elections and that happening. But again, I think it's really going to depend on how people feel about their lives at that moment. And when you are still paying more for eggs and your mortgage is what it is, people feel that in a very real and very daily way. And I think that's also why you don't see the Biden campaign taking a lot of victory laps around this. The stock market hit highs last week, record highs. And we kept thinking, if President Trump were in office right now, there would be a parade down Constitution Avenue, right?
Yeah,
like
Wall Street.
Record high in the stock market. You're not seeing that from the Biden campaign because they realize there's a disconnect between the numbers and the figures and what people are feeling.
Yeah, I mean, we did a poll recently, and we talked to a number of the people who participated in the poll, and what a lot of them told me was like, look, I'm doing better. I'm making $6 more an hour at this job than I was in the Trump administration, but I feel so much worse. I feel like I can't go out as much. I feel like costs are still high. People remember when they were lower. Housing costs are really high. Rent is high. I think people who are fortunate enough to own their home feel like they can't, but want to move can't because interest rates are high. Childcare is really high. If you have an elderly relative, that's really expensive too. So I think the things that like make up an individual household budget feel expensive and are expensive. I didn't even get into the cost of college and all of that. So, people feel bad. They feel like they have less money. And so it's a disconnect between what the indicators are and what the lived economy feels like, and most people are not voting on the indicators. And that is the central problem for the Biden administration. And I think when they were out there touting those numbers, I think to some voters it felt a little bit like they were being gaslit. Like, why are you telling me it's so great when I used to eat out twice a week or once a week or whatever, and now I'm not, So
Now
they
I'm
do have a
delivering food
real
for somebody else to pay the bills.
Right.
Yeah.
So they do have a real, that disconnect is a central problem for Biden's reelection.
And also, to your point about the lived economy, I mean, there are just some things that a president cannot do anything about. He can release some barrels of oil to get the gas prices low headed into Memorial Day weekend, right? But you need to sign your child up for summer camp. Do you have the money to pay for that?
Right.
Your child, yay, just got accepted to go to college. Oh, wait, how much is college? Oh, can he do anything about, he's forgiving student loan after student loan, across the country. I'm surprised that we are not seeing social media videos every single day of somebody who got a letter in the mail saying my student loan debt was just forgiven, right? Like $40,000, $100,000, just wiped clean. Where are those videos? But yeah, 160 million people, have somehow been, where are they? Who are they? We don't know. Like that, I think that is a messaging problem that those voters, those people are probably voters for whom their personal economies improve very much. Where are their stories?
Well, so you bring up an important part of this all, and we're all political nerds here, which is campaign tactics.
Yeah.
How do you see the campaigns approaching this on a tactical level? Are they approaching it like a traditional campaign? Do you see them doing anything outside the box? Maybe let's start with the Trump campaign, since it seems to be qualitatively quite different than the campaigns he's run before, at least in the sense that we haven't heard a bunch of stories about how they're all fighting with each other. But what do you see as the major sort of tactical or strategic push for the Trump campaign?
Well, it's interesting because the Trump campaign is not actually much of a campaign in a way, right? There's no offices, there's not a ton of advertising. Yeah, there's not a lot of staff, there's not a lot of organizational outreach. In terms of what we've all come to expect from a modern campaign, you don't see a lot of that. And look, we just don't, there is a sort of discussion over whether that even matters. Maybe those things don't matter anymore, particularly in an election where everyone's so well known. You can get your voters out through different ways. It doesn't matter. There was this fascinating poll I saw recently where how you get your information determines who you're voting for. So people who are reading sort of mainstream, big newspapers or things like that are more likely to be with Biden. People who are getting their news on social media are more likely to be with Trump. I think Biden is weaker in that social media area, but it's not a campaign like we've come to expect a traditional campaign to be.
True.
What do you think, Amna? Does any of that matter, especially in an era where, so much is...
Honestly, we're asking all these questions. Does it matter? What are the conventions going to look like this year? Indeed. How are those going to play out? We don't have debates the way we have for the last 40 years. It is all new in quite frankly, kind of an exciting way to cover, but just, it makes it a little harder, I think, to be able to say with certainty, we expect this to happen, we expect that to happen. I will say for the Trump campaign's approach, I think what's been interesting to see, and it speaks to this new era we're in, which is generally you see someone come through a primary, taking more extreme positions, really amping up the base, and then moderating that message as you move into the general And we haven't seen any of that when it comes to former President Trump. And partly I think it is because of the lack of a traditional campaign structure that has a messaging strategy and discipline around that a lot just revolves around the candidate or the presumptive nominee himself and what he happens to say and how they want to manage that after he says it. But also a lot of it has to do with the Kennedy campaign. I think they realize that there is a real threat to some of their voters, and they're trying to protect their right flank to some degree and go after some of those Kennedy voters by taking more conservative positions on things that speak to those kinds of supporters. So it's untraditional in all of those ways. It is, it's just different to anything we've seen. And I think it stands in stark contrast to the much more traditional campaign that President Biden has been running, where you're seeing tens of millions of dollars being poured into ads in those swing states. You're seeing a lot of message discipline. You're seeing all the regular hallmarks of what a presidential campaign looks like. And again, that contrast is going to be stark when they stand side by side.
I think what I would add to that, though, is, what you are seeing, and, this is to say nothing about the actual execution of it, but former President Trump seems to think that he really does have some inroads to make with black voters, particularly black men who are feeling ignored, who are feeling like the Democratic Party is not really speaking to them, has not really done very much for them over these past 4 years. Now, does that mean, Trump curious does not necessarily translate into a Trump vote, but again, these are black men who could potentially stay on the couch when Biden needs to do at least as well as he did with black voters 4 years ago, if not better, if he wants to win in November. You're also seeing on ethnic media, particularly Spanish radio, his trying to really strengthen his connection with Latino voters as part of the coalition that he thinks that he will need to win. You're seeing a big push there as well, and not just by him, but by other surrogates. I think that's why you hear somebody like Senator Rubio being in the conversation for these Veep stakes, which I guess we're going to find out in Milwaukee who his VP candidate is, but a much more diverse group of people than I would have thought would have been in the conversation for that role, than especially versus 4 or 8 years ago.
Yeah. We're going to get to your questions in just a minute, so if you have a question, start thinking about it, start formulating. There are microphones here that you can come line up at. We'll also be taking questions from online. Ground rules are it has to be more of a question than a comment, and no arguing with the panelists. But before we get to that, we are at the Kennedy Library. We do have some people in Kennedy t-shirts. Given the dynamics of this campaign and how many Americans say they don't want either of these candidates, frankly, I would expect him to be polling at like 30-40%, like Ross Perot numbers, right? I mean, do we think that the like 10% he's getting now is a floor or a ceiling? And do you see him as more of a left-wing or a right-wing candidate, given his sort of idiosyncratic views? I'll start with you, Errin.
I'm going to say, I'm just going to say what we've been saying is that we don't yet know what the RFK effect is going to be headed into the general, because yes, I've certainly seen people are paying attention. People do want to hear from him as he continues to get more earned media opportunities, as he continues to introduce himself to the rest of the country. I do wonder if and how that will make a difference. I will tell you, the Biden campaign certainly is concerned. You've got the whole Kennedy family hanging out at the White House, you wrapping your arms around them, get the whole Kennedy family to basically endorse you in Philadelphia. Like, clearly you're concerned, right? About any numbers that RFK is potentially able to pull away from him. I don't see that same level of concern from former President Trump in that campaign. I don't know.
I think they're more concerned than they were. I think they thought this would be great for them, and and the polling indicates that it is also a drain on Trump's support. But you got to get on the ballot, so a lot of this will depend on you can't have an impact on an election if you're not on the ballot. So a lot of this will depend how many states he's able to get on the ballot and what those states are and how impactful those states are, for the outcome of the election. A lot of states, as we know, this election is decided by a very small number of people at a very small number of states, even though it's a national election. So does he get on the ballot in those states? How many? And what is the support like in those places? I think will be is the determinative question in a lot of ways.
So I'm going to say something that maybe this row here, I'm sure we're going to hear from you in a second, but I'll say this, which I think a lot of the support we've seen so far, look, 10% for Kennedy across the swing states, those are real numbers, right? Nationally, up to 15% in some cases. And when you add in, Jill Stein at 2%, Cornel West at 2%, like those are difference-making numbers in an election. I think a lot of the support we're seeing at this stage in the race is because of name recognition and because it's a place to put your discontent or lack of enthusiasm with the other two main party candidates. And I think that's why so many Kennedy voters, when polled and asked about it, a good majority of them do say they are likely or would consider changing their vote in the months ahead. We do not know how that's going to play out. Maybe there will be a Kennedy surge. I don't know. But that's where we are right now.
All right, who's got a question? Come up to the mics if you have one, please.
I don't know. You're in charge, Molly.
You're in charge.
There,
I guess they just line
whoever
up.
gets in line
there's one
first
over
gets
there
the first
too.
question. Okay. Don't be shy.
Can I start?
Yeah.
All right. First of all, thank you for taking your time to talk to us tonight. The Democrats have been, you guys talked about it. They're running on democracy. They're putting democracy on the ballot, right? But then they changed DNC primary rules to hurt RFK Jr., and they've spent millions of dollars working to get RFK Jr. to prevent him from getting on the ballot and disenfranchise millions of Americans who support RFK Jr. How do the Democrats deal with that? Like with trying, like, do you think they have to prevent democracy to save democracy?
We're not here to speak for any candidate or party, but,
Well,
do you think there is a tension in the Democratic message? And I'll go to you, Amna. I mean, we hear, Trump has also turned this around and said, no, it's Biden who's attacking democracy by ginning up all these prosecutions. Now, of course, there's no evidence that the White House is behind all the prosecutions, but is there a sense that, the democracy issue is a double-edged sword or is tricky in any way?
I think one of the reasons I've been surprised to learn that so many people are concerned about preserving democracy, I think is when you dig into the numbers, it's a lot of Democrats who say we're worried about the erosion of democratic principles if a candidate with anti-democratic tendencies, as we know former President Trump is, were to come into office. It's also a lot of conservatives who say I'm worried about preserving this democracy that I know and love and it's changing, and so that kind of means different things to different people. I've heard the criticism, thank you for your question, by the way. I've heard the criticism both around, allowing Kennedy on a debate stage, on changing some of those rules early on. I hear them all the time, specifically from Kennedy supporters in particular. And for the Biden campaign, I think, look, they are worried. We've seen that. We've seen a number of social media clips in particular, right? Them kind of juxtaposing things that Kennedy has said versus places he's contradicted himself, or things he said that he didn't say, that then they find the clip and they run it out. They're clearly worried about it. I haven't heard them respond specifically to this question on whether they think that they are somehow eroding their own democratic principles, because I don't think that they would say that they're excluding him. I think that they would say that this is the way that the campaign unfolds, this is the way the process unfolds, and that's the way we're going to do it. I think there's questions around the debates that have not been fully answered yet. And because we're doing it differently this year, we're not going through the commission, the ground rules aren't as transparent and set as they've been in the past. I think we're going to learn a little bit more about that in the weeks ahead, about what those standards are, what the guidelines are that candidates have to meet to make that stage. And I expect some of those questions will be answered.
Let's go over here to this microphone. Sir, go ahead.
Thanks. On the flanks. So I'm not going to bury the lead. I'm wondering what your thoughts are that the Democrat and Republican parties are the latest in a long line of institutions that Americans have lost faith in, and that periodically in history, effectively, there's a falling apart that happens where there's kind of like an unbundling, like what happened with cable packages, with streaming services, or the gig economy from the the normal work culture, where enough people have amassed that really don't have faith in either party or either candidate and don't really know what they stand for in a modern context anymore, that maybe the parties have outlived the original context of what they stood for. And I'm wondering if, thinking about an obvious example in the last 80 years, FDR, he had to thread the needle between the extremes, the communists and the fascists, and he had to pull together a lot of disengaged people who just dropped out of the system entirely. He had to pull together populists from both parties that had disengaged from their parties. And I'm just wondering if how you feel that these trends play into the current situation and how the parties are affected by that, the existing parties.
I think you put your finger on something that's really real, which is like both parties are in this moment of significant transformation. And we don't totally know where that's going to go. I think in some ways, Biden running for a second term sort of arrested that a little bit in the Democratic Party, but that debate is going to happen. Like he's not going to run if he wins, he's not going to run again. So there'll be a very open debate in the Democratic primary in the next election where I think you'll see a lot of long-held positions, like, for example, Israel, like we were talking earlier in the support for Israel, reconsidered by the party, and that'll be hashed out like if Biden wins again, in that second term of his administration, and certainly once they get into the primary and once they get into that next presidential election, which if Biden wins will happen like the next day, right? Everyone will start running for president. There's a backlog of a bench there. So I think you'll definitely see that. Now where that ends up, I don't know, but that clearly that is a party on the in the middle of like this period of change, and we've definitely seen that in the Republican Party. Like Trump transformed that party. I mean, traditional Republican pillars like, support for free trade, or even, when you're talking about Ukraine, those things have all been remade, and he's doing it now, perhaps with abortion, right? And so that party has also been really changed over like the Trump sort of era. And I think if Trump, these are not young men, right? They can't do this. At some point, they can't do this anymore. And so it'll be the same kind of thing, I think, in some way with Trump. We don't know what a post-Trump Republican Party looks like, but it's not going to look like the pre-Trump Republican Party. So I don't one thing I've learned in this job is you are really not in the prediction business, and if you get in that business, you are doing something wrong, and you are probably getting it wrong. So I can't tell you where it's going to go, but I do think you're right that we are in a moment of like really significant political reshuffling and change for both parties.
Well, and I was going to add to that. I mean, I feel like because we are looking at this rematch, right, of these two white men of a certain age, what you do have is really voters thinking more about their power than the power that they are giving somebody by electing them. It's not about, for them, even one particular candidate, but it is about the power that they have to shape this democracy. And so it is not just about Election Day. It is about holding people accountable beyond Election Day. Watching people as they govern, the people that they are putting into these roles. But so many voters, I think, in both parties are really thinking about how can I be valued not just for my output, but also for my input.
Well, we consistently see in polls that voters wish they had more options.
Always.
Voters
Yeah.
wish, and people have been disaffiliating from the two major parties. So why hasn't there been a flourishing third party movement of some sort in this country? Is it just that disaffection doesn't have a sort of policy valence to it, and all those people who don't like the major parties all want different things? I mean, there was this effort to have a no labels candidate this cycle, and it sort of fell apart because nobody wanted to do it. But that was an attempt to say, the two parties are too extreme and we need a sort of a third way, an option in the middle. Is it just that the two parties have such a lock on the process that they're able to sort of monopolistically shut everybody else out? Why do you think it hasn't happened?
I think it's really hard to start a viable third party. It's just hard for the process reasons you're talking about, even the logistical reasons of getting on the ballot. I think voting, people sort of vote historically, right? Like it's hard to break those patterns that people have over, their years of their voting life. It's so I just think it's a hard, and it's expensive, right? It's really expensive. And so it's a hard, very expensive thing to start.
Let's go to this microphone right here, sir, please.
Yeah, thank you. My question is the role of the vice president selection for Trump this cycle, because like as you guys have stated, like Trump and Biden are both really well known, and people have very ingrained opinions. So I'm just curious to hear what you guys think about like the role of the VP selection, either expanding or narrowing Trump's coalition.
Great question. Who wants to take that? Amna, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I do think one of the things we know is top of mind from former President Trump is loyalty.
Yes.
And I think you've seen that already on display among the many people who are vying for that vice presidential slot. It's showing up outside of his criminal trial, wearing matching outfits in some cases. It's all very surreal. And you see, as people are going out and giving interviews and making the case for him, mimicking a lot of the language that he is, repeating the big lie about the 2020 election. This is the audition process that, in a way that we know he wants to see it unfold. I will say, you probably couldn't have gotten anyone more loyal than Mike Pence when he was previously president. And so, until his life was at risk and he wasn't. And so I think the test, or sort of the bar for former President Trump has risen, which is to find someone who is so incredibly loyal as to never contradict or go against anything that he says, but also potentially helps him with some areas where he is weak, particularly in suburban areas, particularly among women. There's probably kind of starting to coalesce around a few people. I've heard Doug Burgum's name kind of floated around there, Elise Stefanik's name floated around there, Marco Rubio's name floated around there. We just don't know. In particular with this candidate is someone who's liable to make a decision based on how he feels in the moment. We just don't know.
Yeah, it's hard for me to see. I mean, the traditional thinking around vice presidents selection is it's more of like a do no harm situation. Like they try to get someone who balances out like the ticket, whatever the deficiency of the presidential candidate is, to try to like get a little balance there. That's why former President Obama picked Biden, because Biden was experienced, Obama was young, try to shake that out a little bit. But I just don't think a lot of people are voting on vice presidency, and particularly when you have someone who is as well known, who is sparks such strong emotions, both for and against, as Trump. I don't know. It's hard for me to see it being a deeply decisive factor, but I'm sure the whole process will be conducted with a lot of pomp and a lot of like ready for TV moments.
Apprentice style.
Yeah, apprentice style. It's gonna be fun. I mean, it'll be fun for me to watch, right? Fun for us. But I don't know like how much it has an actual impact on votes.
Well, I do think the process, though, is interesting to watch, because, again, it is a much more diverse process on the Republican side than I thought we were going to be seeing this cycle. There was definitely a time where I thought, surely he's going to pick a woman. He's going to want somebody, to go up against Vice President Harris. In that way, to kind of create this, I guess, equivalency in voters' minds, maybe, but I don't know. Kristi Noem and Doggate, Puppygate notwithstanding, don't really know that she's really in the running anymore. But I mean, Tim Scott, somebody who certainly seems to be a viable candidate. Vivek Ramaswamy, somebody that seems to be a pretty viable for that role. In addition to, Nikki Haley saying that she's going to vote for President Trump. I don't know if she's still in the running, but certainly somebody that a lot of people were excited about and maybe want to see on a ticket with him. I don't know how likely that is, but Elise Stefanik. So you've got women, you've got people of color in this conversation on the Republican side in a way that I did not expect to see this year.
Let's go over here.
Hello, I work at the JFK Library, and I'm here to ask a question from our online audience.
Thank you, online audience.
And their question is, does Nikki Haley backing Trump now affect the support for Trump? How will that impact things moving forward?
What a lovely topical question. Thank you, online audience, and a perfect segue from what we were just talking about. Lisa, what do you think?
I have been struck by the number of Nikki Haley holdouts in these primaries that are still continuing. People who are voting for like what we call a zombie candidate, somebody who's not on the ballot. I don't know. I'm not sure that those voters now, it may help some, it's hard to know, but I think a lot of the voters I spoke to who were supporting Haley were people who were looking for an alternative to Trump, and to Biden, of course. And it wasn't so, some of them really liked Nikki Haley for a lot of reasons, but a lot of them just wanted another option. They didn't want it to be a coronation in that primary of Trump. And so, it's always been a question of whether Trump can unify the party. And I think part of what may be the issue for some of those voters is even if she is coming around and saying, okay, I'll support Trump, he's not exactly welcoming her. He's not doing much to reach out to those voters. There's been no effort. I think you mentioned earlier how striking that is, because traditionally what you see is after a divisive primary, the person who wins brings the party together, and we really haven't seen that. So I don't know if those voters now all of a sudden, some of them will certainly go to Trump, they're Republicans, right? But if they all flock to Trump, if there's not much of an effort being made to get them.
And she's saying that he needs to earn
Right,
those votes, right? Even as, you had President Biden saying just after her announcement, what was that, yesterday, I guess? What is time in post-pandemic? But, she makes this announcement that she's planning to vote for Trump. President Biden says the very next day, hey, but by the way, still, you all are still welcome here, is the message that he puts out. Even, we don't, and we hear nothing from former President Trump saying, hello, Haley voters, we would love to have you.
What I keep hearing from Haley voters, though, many of whom it will not surprise you to hear are Wall Street Journal readers, is that yes, the Biden campaign has actually aired ads saying you're welcome in our tent. Haley voters, you don't have to vote for Trump. You can come vote for Biden. But they feel like they're not getting anything from Biden on policy. Right. They feel like he hasn't done anything on the border. They don't like the way he's managing the economy. They don't like the way he's managing foreign policy. I mean, to your point about Trump not moderating for the general election, they feel like Biden hasn't done that either. And these people are still Republicans, right? And the Haley vote was sort of a symptom of wanting a more traditional Republican candidate. And so I do wonder whether the outreach that Biden is actually making, and that Trump definitely is not, is going to be, it seems to me that Haley saying she's going to vote for Trump, even as she's not telling anyone else to do that, she's sort of a typical Republican, right? And what we saw in 2016 and in 2020 was that those typical Republicans would come home to Trump at the end of the day because they couldn't bear to vote for a Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome here and we don't hate you is not the same thing as, here's what
we're going to run the country in the way that you would prefer. Exactly.
The Biden campaign does think those people are gettable. And what they look at is the number of voters who switched from supporting Trump in 20 to supporting a Democratic candidate in 22. And there's like a pool of people there, some of whom are Republicans. I suspect some of, I haven't run the numbers, but some of whom one would think are likely Haley voters who they think they can kind of win over, particularly if they're able to cut into this Trump, what they see as this Trump amnesia problem. So I think it's really an open question.
Let's go right here, another question.
Yes, hello. In response to the conversation about where things are polling with Americans and what's important to them, what subjects and what matters to them mostly, in response to that particular concern with the erosion of freedom, I've recently read that Hill has reported, as well as multiple legal papers have reported, a preliminary win for Kennedy against Biden regarding the subversion of his First Amendment rights, where he was removed from multiple social media platforms. And as First Amendment rights not only include our ability to speak, but also our ability to know. I want to know how you feel about your news groups, in that none of you have reported this recent win by Kennedy against Biden on this injunction, that where the decision by Dowdy has decided that his right of free speech has been infringed upon.
Well, I can't speak to that particular issue that you're raising because I haven't covered it, but I can tell you that we at the New York Times have a full-time reporter on the Kennedy campaign. We write a lot about that campaign. She attends a lot of the events. We're taking him for us to assign somebody to a candidate, it's like we are taking that campaign seriously and we're watching that as a really influential piece of this election. So I must admit, I don't know this specific issue, but I can say that's not traditional for us, for a for like a for a third party candidate. Like often we have someone who sort of keeps an eye on a bunch of, if there's a couple, we keep an eye on a couple of them. And we certainly don't always have someone on the third party candidates this early in the race. But this year we do, and I think it is a testament to how influential we think Kennedy can be in this race.
I think there's another interesting aspect to this campaign, which is just how unsettled the information environment is, right? I mean, this is really the first presidential campaign since the rise of TikTok, which according to Pew, as many as a third of voters under 30 are primarily getting their news from TikTok, which, the Senate and House of Representatives believe is a national security threat, and they're going to ban it after the election if it's not sold off. I mean, how much of an influence do you think it has, just the fact that it's so splintered where people are getting their news, and we can't necessarily trust that the things that we report and know are true are sort of getting through to people out there in the electorate?
Yeah, I feel like that is becoming increasingly important, but I will take us into the Wayback Machine to 2016 when Russia was directly targeting Black women voters in particular because of the influential and reliable voting bloc that they were then. Targeting them on social media specifically, right? So targeting voters of color on social media who we know disproportionately get their information from social media is not something that's new, but it is something that has spread because it has been effective. I think in the pandemic, we definitely saw how mis and disinformation, especially on social media platforms, was effective. I think you have to talk about AI and the role of AI in 2024, which is unprecedented and is going to play a role. It's something that certainly I think we as a political press have to be concerned about. I think it is something that these campaigns are concerned about and are monitoring because that does have the potential. If voters don't know the difference between what it is that folks like us are doing and really the much more sophisticated misinformation, right? I mean, this is not Hillary Clinton's alien baby in the National Enquirer at the checkout line, right? Like this is.
Wait, are you saying that wasn't true?
Apparently, turns out, fact check. No, there was no alien baby. But I mean, the good news is, you have a lot of people that are much more interested in politics and seeking out information. The bad news is, what they're getting is not, always factual, and so trusted sources of information are more important than ever. But also, that is a very, very perilous terrain for folks that are seeking that out.
Thank you so much for your question. Do we have another? Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that you've spoken to voters who are apparently afraid for their physical safety in the wake of the election, presumably because of civil unrest. And I'd like you to address, if you would, the role of the media in fomenting those views. I heard on public radio today, I heard Trump for the, 13th time being compared to Hitler. I hear all the time that this election could mean the end of democracy, that we wouldn't, I think it was mentioned tonight, that it may be the last time we'll be able to vote in an election. If the media is going to continue to hype this idea that we are facing an existential threat in this election, and the media I listen to, because I'm a Democrat, they're obviously saying don't vote for Trump, vote for Biden, but I presume the same thing is going on the right. Wouldn't a third-party candidate who can be a reconciliation candidate be a possible way to resolve that, what you're describing as a very real and dangerous concern, where you have approximately half the electorate not accepting the person who wins?
I do think that there is thank you for that question. We do spend so much time talking about the sort of extremes in our politics, and there are so many voters who are going about their lives and for whom everything is normal and fine. I just went to a college campus for a story on the students who aren't out there protesting, which is approximately 90% of college students, right? And they feel similarly to you, that there's all this, noise and yelling and extremes all around them, and they would just like there to be a quiet place where they can talk and nobody yells at them. So what do you think about that?
Part of this is being driven by the candidates, right? It is Biden who is getting up there and saying democracy is under siege and this election is an existential choice. It is Trump who is getting up there and saying, the deep state is coming for me, the entire government is broken, we need to blow up the system, right? The candidates are driving this. And it's interesting because I did a piece on, it's also like there's a lot of data showing that political violence is up, right? Like members of Congress have more security, get more threats than they have in like anyone can remember, right? The FBI puts out all these various warnings about increase in sort of hate groups and like militia groups within the country. Like those things are sort of are quantitative measures that are happening in the country. So I think some of those fears are grounded in what people are seeing. And it's interesting because I did a piece on political violence in 2021, right? So that was after Biden. And one of the things we looked at was just how the rhetoric had changed, how you have candidates getting up there and talking about tyranny and using phrasing that we just didn't hear, 10 years ago or whatever. And so I do think these concerns are coming, first of all, the candidates are reflecting what is a real concern that people have. I mean, you look at even that movie Civil War, right? Like that did blockbuster, like it topped the box office for multiple weeks, which is not really what happens to that kind of, it was sort of more of an art house. It wasn't a Marvel movie, right?
That's true.
Yeah, and I think that's reflecting something that's in the culture,
Well, I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
I mean, January 6th was in the culture.
Right.
And the media didn't do that.
Yeah.
The insurrection happened. That was a thing that happened in our democracy, right? So like the threat of political violence is real. That was something that we did not think that we were going to see as a democracy. And so where do we go, in the first election since the insurrection? Like that's a real question that people have that is coming from a real place because that was the thing that we actually experienced. Not to mention the threat of political violence against poll workers. Like that is not a thing that was happening before. Like people, the lovely people that help us facilitate free and fair and safe elections are now saying, this is not what I signed up for. Like that is not like a thing that we're perpetuating. That is a thing that is real, that is happening. Folks who are thinking about running for office but do not want to because their spouse could be attacked or because they might be part of the target of a kidnapping plot. Like these are things that
Or even
are
the
happening.
threats, frankly, that we get in the media. I mean,
Well,
the security.
you're not even to get to that. We weren't gonna
Yeah.
make it about us, but yes, also
Well,
that.
I'm just saying, like, I
Yes.
mean, our security apparatus has grown exponentially at the paper.
We're just
I
about
will
out of
say-
time. I want to
Can I
do.
just say one thing
Yeah.
about that? Because I think it's important in response to the question that was asked, and thank you for that. I do think all of us up here, all of our colleagues I know as well, take our responsibility very seriously to add light and not heat to these conversations. But this goes back to the question of where people get their information. If you are watching breathless media that only focuses on the protests that get violent or only focuses on moments of political violence and doesn't focus, like we do in a lot of cases, on local stories on the ground where a lot of these divisions that play out at the national level are not as acute, then I suggest you change news sources as well. But the concern, I think, that undergirds a lot of our reporting around political violence is based on the data, and it is based on historical trends. And it's
real
the
events.
idea that even in the time leading up to the Civil War, even through the Civil War, even at the time of white and state violence against civil rights activists in the 50s and 60s, we never had someone try to stop the peaceful transfer of power through political violence, and we have now had that. And this is something that happens in democracies in decline around the world, and it has now happened here, and it's happening here. And the numbers show that people are more prone, they have a greater proclivity for political violence on both sides of the partisan divide. 40% of election workers or elected officials have received some kind of threats. In some cases, the threats are worse for women and people of color. I was talking to 2 secretaries of state earlier today who have go bags in their homes because one had an armed man show up at her home with her and her child inside. Another has gotten so many threats, he may need to change locations. I mean, this is a new point in history for our country. And I think, I hope you know, and I hope everyone here watching at home knows that we take our responsibility to cover it responsibly but accurately very, very seriously.
We're just about out of time. Let's hear both of these questions, and we'll do a quick lightning round, and then we'll wrap up. I don't want to end on that dark a note, but so let's hear both of these questions, and then I'm sorry we're not going to get to everyone.
So I have another question from an online audience member. Regarding the comments that Haley Republicans feel Biden has done nothing on immigration, is Trump blocking immigration reform registering?
And you, sir?
Okay. It's on concentration of wealth and the importance of the economy to an average voter. And none of the metrics I've seen kind of are weighted by the number of people. So it is entirely possible to have an economy that has never been better, and a majority of people feel like it's not. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, why keep talking about the economy in aggregate? You know, why keep talking about, yeah, it's never been better, when it's not so good for a lot of people who are now working 60 hours a week? And following that, each candidate's policies are so different in their impact on the average worker, which I tend to believe should be favoring Biden, versus not the average worker, like corporations, income tax, etc. So why talk about the economy in general, and why not the impact of each candidate's views on that issue?
Or even more to your point, why not talk to voters about how the economy is impacting them, the people on the ground versus the people that are at the top, controlling the economy or benefiting from, how great this economy is now. To Amna's point about, the stock market hitting record numbers, what does that mean to the Uber driver, the Instacart delivery person, the, young mom who's trying to get back to work but cannot find childcare? Like, hearing from those people about, talking to people about issues, even not respective of which party they're planning to support, but hearing from them on their issues about their daily lives, and then trying to understand and unpack how that is going to impact how they participate in our political process.
I was going the other way. I was saying, why aren't the candidates able to connect with people who are working 60 hours and pointing out if they're going to help them or not?
I think that's a question for the campaigns.
Yes.
Yeah. Why aren't they?
Okay, and then
But
media has to come.
I do think narrative change that focuses the conversation back on the people being impacted by these policies. I mean, maybe that does help reframe how candidates are talking to people. If we are talking about what the impact is on people's lives, and not just at the top of the ticket, but for anybody that is able to do anything about this economy for the people that they're supposed to be representing.
And I'll just point out, as a personal plug, we at the NewsHour have been doing a series of reports where we literally just take one issue or one topic and compare the candidates' policy proposals and their records. So that's out there.
Everyone
That's
should
good
check
summary.
it
I
out.
don't see it.
Well, we are out of time. I want to thank everyone, thank our panelists for this amazing discussion, thank the Kennedy Library for hosting this amazing discussion, and thank all of you for coming out tonight. This has been so much fun for all of us, and I hope it has been for you too. Thank you.